It's been a long journey from the last time I was here until now. As Peter said, I first went to Iraq in 1997 for the New York Times and went back many times under the old regime, and then went back post-invasion from August until October of 2003. Um, and really just caught up with my friends and contacts and um, former nemesis and minders and apparatchiks and floor cleaners and Sufi tariqas and artists and lots of different people who all ended up coming into the book. Um, so really the time that I was there post-invasion, with hindsight, it was a bit of a window of opportunity where I was still able to just barely be safe enough in going out to people's homes and churches and mosques and marketplaces and actually talking to real Iraqis and getting real Iraqi opinions. The challenge has always been for me as a journalist and a writer to communicate Iraqi reality to a Western audience. Under the old regime, of course, there was a system of minders, like in the Soviet Union, where we had to basically pay for the privilege of being spied on by these mukhabarat, secret policemen, who preferred to call themselves guides, as if they were working as benign Ministry of Tourism bureaucrats. Anyway, I actually went back and met one of my minders, who bizarrely was working for ABC News as a fixer, because in addition to the invading troops, there were all kinds of journalists who came and took advantage of the fact that you didn't need a visa after all those years of very tight visa restrictions. So there were all these journalists who had really kind of come in on the back of a tank, so to speak, who didn't really have the context of what it was like before. And I think it's so important to understand Iraq, to know what what led up to the current situation. So I hope that my book will offer some insight into how the country was shaped by years of war and sanctions and dictatorship. But at the same time, I hope that it will really communicate to people a sense of the culture and the vitality and the resilience and the spirit, the ruhe of the Iraqi people, who are very strong, very proud people with a very vibrant and lively culture that sadly, even though it survived the worst excesses of Saddam and of 12 years of the most draconian sanctions ever visited upon a modern nation, it doesn't look like things are going well at the moment. Iraq, since the invasion, has become a sort of de facto theocracy where the combined forces of criminal anarchy and Islamic fundamentalism have meant that now there's a situation where even live music is banned, in essence. I met a young musician in Vancouver from Baghdad who said he left. I said, "Why did you leave?" "Because of the security situation." And he said, "Oh, well, I could handle that, but I couldn't make my living anymore as a musician because I wasn't allowed to play in public." So it's quite something for me to think of the cradle, the former cradle of civilization, now being a place where music is banned. So really, I hope to communicate some of the beauty of the place and of the culture, as well as, obviously some of the horrors. So I'm going to start reading a bit from the chapter called "War is Over," which was actually the name of, I know there's the Yoko Ono, John Lennon song, but this was actually the name of a hit single by Kazem al-Saher, who is one of Iraq's great pop stars. And on my en route to post-invasion Iraq, as I did so many times, I went through Amman, Jordan, and which was and still is home to a huge refugee population. So I went to this music festival, and Kazem al-Saher was headlining with Sarah Brightman, this English kind of pop opera diva, and they were singing "War is Over," this English Arabic song. And of course, the irony was that it wasn't, but So I found myself in the middle of a riot, in fact. A riot broke out because all these young men who were refugees from Iraq, who couldn't afford the $100 ticket price that the sort of bourgeois Jordanians paid to get in, were duking it out with the Jordanian police. So it suddenly turned really violent, and I was kind of caught in the middle of it in an unfortunate cocktail outfit, because I just come from having cocktails at this reception with the Queen of Jordan, Queen Rania, and so I was in the wrong outfit in the wrong place at the wrong time. You know how that is. Anyway, so this is this is a little bit from that. You know, you get dressed in the afternoon and you just don't anticipate you're going to be in a riot. So 5 years on, in the amphitheater in Jordan, I could not watch from the sidelines as homesick Iraqis danced with their hearts and hips. I made my way down toward the center of the stage, framed by fans and menacing-looking military police. Tottering in my heels and balancing 2 cameras over my shawl, I somehow managed to jump 5 feet down from the last row of ancient stone seats and join the dancing in the mosh pit. As I watched the young Iraqis dance, I reflected on all that their nation had endured. In the 20th century, it had survived British occupation, the installation and dissolution of a monarchy, a CIA-backed coup that had brought the Ba'ath Party to power, the rise of Saddam Hussein, and a harrowing war with neighboring Iran. Then, after 8 years of hellish conflict that left hundreds of thousands dead on both sides and almost bankrupted Iraq, Saddam invaded Kuwait. George Bush Sr. used the opportunity to bomb Iraq back into the Stone Age in an $85 billion crusade. Far from the glorified video game it appeared to be on Western television screens, the Gulf War was a violent assault on an impoverished nation that left an estimated 150,000 Iraqi civilians dead and violated several Geneva Conventions. Thousands of retreating Iraqi soldiers were massacred by American troops, and water treatment plants were deliberately targeted. But what followed was worse. 10 years of the harshest sanctions in the history of the UN, exacerbated by Saddam's despotism, left half of the Iraqi population without access to clean drinking water and 30% of adults suffering from anemia, the majority women in their childbearing years. Before the embargo, Iraq's socialized medicine and great oil wealth had meant that the biggest health issue was obesity. By the mid-90s, infant mortality was on a par with sub-Saharan Africa. The Iraqi dinar was devalued by more than 1,000%, and almost overnight, the lives of most citizens went from comfortable to desperate, with many women forced to prostitute themselves to feed their families. The education system, once the envy of the Arab world, was in ruins. The resulting brain drain saw 1/5 of the population emigrate, many to neighboring countries, the luckiest to Britain and America, the same countries whose fighter planes were taking part in regular bombing raids in the so-called no-fly zones. While a small number of Iraqis, including Saddam's family and cronies, were enriching themselves through sanctions profiteering, life for the majority was grim. The middle class disappeared, and the gap between rich and poor grew into a gulf. People with PhDs drove taxis, while uneducated smugglers drove Mercedes. The Baghdad book market was full of exquisite Arabic and English volumes, family heirlooms being sold for a few dollars by parents hoping to scrape together enough money to buy medicine for their children. In the absence of any cultural, social, or economic development, a whole new generation of angry, unemployed, and unmarried young men was seduced by the lure of Hollywood action movies and the promise of fundamentalist Islam. This was the legacy the Americans inherited when they invaded in 2003. Their motherland was in dire straits, but still the young Iraqis danced, a sense of violence and despair hanging over their ecstasy. I noticed that as the night wore on, the few young women in the crowd, mainly dressed in jeans and t-shirts and often waving Iraqi flags, began to edge away from the stage, retreating back to the seating area. The crowd was wild and grew even wilder when the last song ended. Before I knew it, I was caught up in a swarm of young Iraqi men, grabbing, pushing, and shoving me in all directions. I started to scream and kick my way out. A Jordanian policeman stepped in, and a male festival organizer had to accompany me all the way outside, standing behind me the whole time. As a taxi carried me away, Al-Saher's melody was still ringing in my head. This is one of his lyrics. "O Baghdad, Baghdad, you are in my blood." My own connection to Iraq was beginning to feel inescapable. After 6 years of reporting from the troubled but fascinating country, I felt somehow joined to it, as if our destinies were entwined. It seemed to be with me always, not only in neighboring Jordan, but even in faraway Vancouver, where I was forever meeting Iraqis who told sad tales of exile and longing. In less than a decade, I had witnessed crisis after crisis, writing of doctors and dying children, missiles and wrecked infrastructure, but also of hope and happiness, of music, theater, poetry, even dancing. After this latest invasion, I had decided to return to find all the people I'd come to know over my last 5 trips to Iraq. The actors, the writers, the mothers, the children, the minders, the doctors, the imams and the priests, Sufis and poets, hotel clerks and floor cleaners, and even bureaucrats. I wanted to write the epilogue to their stories. I wanted to see if they were still alive, if their families were safe, to see how they were doing after the latest trauma that had swept through their land like some rampant fire, destroying everything in its path, while the arsonists promised redemption, freedom, democracy. I knew I might not even find them in the post-war chaos, with no telephones, no electricity, no security, but at least I could tread in their old footsteps and in mine as well, in the hopes of finding some sliver of illumination, some momentary epiphany to calm my fears about the future. I wanted people to know about the real Iraq, not the superficial televised version, but communicating that reality had always been a Herculean task, fraught with racism, ignorance, and cultural blind spots. I had received a message from Ramzi Kasia, the tireless humanitarian from North Carolina, who has worked for years in Iraq with a group called Voices in the Wilderness. In it, he warned me of the dangers of the new Iraq, the kidnappings, rapes, and murders that had now become commonplace. It was a grim portrait of life during continuing wartime, and I immediately thought of all the times I'd walked alone and unhassled down Al Sadoun Street, shopped in the souks, and gone to the theater at night. I shuddered to think that Iraq might end up as another Afghanistan, invaded, then abandoned and forgotten. I did not want Joe Public to read yet another grisly news item about terrorism in Iraq, the self-fulfilling prophecy of the American neocon cabal, and shake his head and say, "Those crazy Iraqis." I'm not sure why I care so much about Iraq. Perhaps it has something to do with my mixed Middle Eastern and North American ancestry, but I think that anyone who's spent more than a few months in the country gets hooked in an almost masochistic way. It's a land that stretches the very fiber of your being, pulling you between despair and euphoria, pushing your spiritual and psychological limits until you're convinced there really is a God, or at the very least some benevolent goddess, some behind-the-scenes Ishtar pulling strings beyond the parameters of your usual mortal existence. Cradle of civilization, birthplace of Abraham, capital of the Islamic world under the great Caliph Harun al-Rashid, and more recently a center of pan-Arabism in artistic and intellectual life, Iraq is not a place to be considered lightly. It is a place to read poetry, a place to study holy books, to ponder the meaning of civilization. It is a place to dance, a place to sing maqam, the eternal expression of love and longing. It is a place you remember, not just for its long-dead gods and kings and architects, but also for their descendants, the men and women and children who live on its ancient earth, despite the landmines and depleted uranium and heartbreaking violence. And so perhaps that's what I can do. After all, I am only a writer. I eke out an existence in dollars and words. But somewhere between the fire and the garden, I can remember. O Baghdad, Baghdad, you are in my blood. So now I'm going to read a little bit from the next chapter, which is called Fly Me to the Moon. The reason I chose that title was because it is a bit like going to the moon, going there. But later in the chapter I talk about the Saddam International Airport, which is now the Baghdad Airport, which I visited during under the sanctions regime. And when I interviewed the Iraqi Airways staff that used to go there every day, even though the airport was closed for, I guess, 7, 8 years because of the no-fly zones. They would go every day, even though their salaries had devalued by, 1,000%. They'd just earn a few dollars a month as state employees. They'd go every day just to keep up appearances, and they'd go in their uniforms and they'd drink coffee and they'd practice English. And the young flight staff, some of whom had never been up in a plane before, would do simulated flying classes, and they'd water the plants. And so the airport was like Sleeping Beauty, And there was actually on the departure board this light flashing that said, now boarding, flight to Cairo, and it was January 15th, 1991, which was the day the Gulf War started. So now, since the invasion, it's become various things: a prison, Tariq Aziz was held there for a while, a money printing factory, and a Burger King. So I'm not sure if there's some weird symbiotic relationship between those three, but so this is see, I had to fly in because it was too dangerous to drive because of all the highway bandits. And at that time, you weren't allowed to go in if you were a journalist, only if you were working for an NGO or what was left of the UN or working for the military. A few days later, I found myself flying into Baghdad, thinking not of poetry or love, but of surface-to-air missiles. I tried to relax and block such thoughts from my heat-oppressed mind, but it was hard when I was sitting next to the head honcho for the American Coalition Provisional Authority, the CPA, in Baghdad. If it hadn't been for my friend, L, he remains nameless in the book, he's just referred to by one initial, which you'll understand why if you read the book. If it hadn't been for my friend L, a Canadian businessman whose uncanny skills had helped him prosper under both the old and new regimes, I never would have made it onto the flight. On most of my previous trips to Iraq, I'd come by car along the treacherous highway that runs through lunar-like desert terrain from Amman to Baghdad. This was always a difficult voyage, but more so since the war, with murderous bandits now lurking among the Bedouin villages and vast stretches of no man's land. Susan, a contact of L's who worked for a security firm with the unlikely name of Custer Battles, had arranged the plane ticket for me. "There is one thing you must never do," her travel agent had told me when I booked. "You must never let anyone know you are a journalist." It seemed these flights, organized by the CPA, were then off limits to anyone but CPA staff, military types, a few select Washington-backed NGOs, and what remained of the UN presence in Iraq. "What should I say if anyone asks me what I'm doing?" I asked her. "Just say that you work for Custer Battles." The company was in charge of security at the Baghdad airport. Several months later, the US State Department would charge it with massive fraud. Now, I'd met some security fellows There were some staying at my hotel. I'd had dinner with them the night before, big burly guys with Manchester accents, ex-British military types who'd probably seen action in Northern Ireland. You wouldn't want to mess with them. They had tattooed biceps but got all sentimental when they talked about their mums. They were working for ABC News. When I went to purchase my ticket later that day from the Royal Jordanian office, a motherly type named Nafisa looked me up and down. "Who do you work for?" she asked. Custer Battles," I demurred, my head suddenly full of cowboys and Indians. "Are you sure you're not a journalist?" she inquired. "You know they're not allowed on these flights." I looked at Nafisa. I put my hand to my heart and offered up an earnest expression that I hoped would convey, "No, of course I'm not a journalist. Do I look like one? A journalist would be taller and blonder and wear a flak jacket and have more money and always be an American no matter what side of the 49th parallel they came from. A journalist would also be a man and carry much neater notebooks than mine. He would have a small silver flask of whiskey in his back pocket, and his name would never be Hadani." "I work for Custer Battles," I repeated. "I'm in accounting." After a sleepless night, I took a taxi at 4 a.m. the next morning to Amman's military airport. I slumped into a chair in the tiny waiting room and surveyed the scene. Nattily dressed RAF officers chatted discreetly while uniformed Americans fiddled with their hand luggage. This was already a very different experience than the midnight Iraqi border one. Instead of the usual visitors from dodgy regimes, international businessmen, and the odd peace activist, here I was surrounded by English-speaking men in uniform. I was somewhat of a novelty. The middle-aged blonde man sitting next to me had taken me by surprise, striking up a conversation in the waiting lounge. "Where are you from?" he'd wondered with an American twang. Canada," I mumbled. "And you?" "I'm from Virginia. My name's Hank." I introduced myself, and then Hank asked, "What are you doing in Baghdad?" Working for an NGO," I managed, which seemed a good answer. "Oh yeah," said Hank casually. "Which one?" "Quick, think," I told my sleepy self, racking my brain for NGO names. Finally, after what seemed an eternity with Hank's unblinking military gaze staring me down, I blurted out, "SAPED." SAPED was the actual acronym of a small grassroots NGO I'd recently become acquainted with. They were hippies from the Shuswap area of British Columbia who worked with peasant cooperatives in Guatemala and had expressed some interest in assisting the Women's Center in Gaza that I'd written about for Ms. Magazine. We'd also spoken before I left Vancouver about the possibility of starting a women's project in Iraq, so my narrative was not entirely fiction. I'm looking to identify ways in which we can support appropriate women's projects, women's and children's projects. And what are you doing in Iraq? I added before he could ask me any more awkward questions. "Well," he smiled, "some people call me the mayor of Baghdad. I'm the regional director for the CPA in Baghdad." And then he pulled a red lollipop from his knapsack and began to suck on it. Hank had just come back from a week's vacation, a fishing trip with his daughter on the Potomac. It was really relaxing, he told me, his blue eyes sparkling, and we caught lots of mackerel. I asked him how long he'd been on the job. "About a month," he replied, with a tone that still suggested a hint of eagerness. "Isn't it hard to tell who the real Baathists are?" I asked Hank after we'd put on our seatbelts on the plane. "I mean, the ones that gave the orders, not the ones that followed them?" Hank smiled. "Oh no, the have-nots were pretty quick to tell us who the haves were under the old regime." Soon afterwards, the CPA admitted they were recruiting former Mukhabarat, Saddam's old intelligence officers. Hank was an old U.S. aid hand who'd worked in El Salvador and Bolivia. Like many in the CPA, he had far more experience in Latin America than in the Middle East. His Spanish was fluent, but he spoke no Arabic. I wondered later if the American adventure in Iraq had failed in part because they'd assumed the country was just another banana republic that would be swayed by fistfuls of dollars and armies of mercenaries. So I sit next to this fellow on the plane, and even though I haven't slept, for 24 hours, and I keep worrying that there's going to be a surface-to-air missile, I used the opportunity to I took on this kind of missionary status, telling him all about Iraqi women, which he knew nothing about, that they had the highest status at one point in the Arab world and the most liberal family law, and were there any programs in place to assist Iraqi women in the transition? And he said, well, we're working on something. Why don't you come by the palace and tell us about your research when you've done a little bit more? And so I ended up a week later in the Republican palace that had been taken over by the Americans, which was very weird and interesting and disturbing. So I ended up developing this idea for a project which I, in a moment of inspiration, called the Garden of Peace, which was essentially a community garden meets kindergarten women's center, which was kind of a good idea, except soon I realized that as the insurgency and the tensions and everything increased, I would have to spend most of the budget on security, and I would be putting all the women and children in the center in direct danger, and the only funding body to fund it would be US Aid. So, yeah. Let's see, now I'll just read you a little bit. I made these notes, and I can't read my writing. Isn't that terrible? Oh, I know. I thought I would read you a little bit from my visit to Abu Ghraib prison. Are you getting restless in your seats, or? No. Okay, that's good. So you'll have to buy the book and read it to find out what happens at the end with Hank. But so this is from the prison, from the chapter called A Prison and Two Morgues, which is partly recounting this very surreal PR tour that I was on with some of the members of the International Press Corps, led by Janis Karpinski, in fact, in September of 2003, about 8 months before the scandal broke. It was quite creepy at the time, but then, in hindsight, reading this, rife with irony, the same old creepy Ba'athist doctor who'd been employed under Saddam to issue death certificates when prisoners died accidentally, was now working for the new regime. So there were questions that were all lingering in our minds, but we weren't allowed to see any of the prisoners. And Robert in here is Robert Fisk, who I was traveling with at the time. I did a little work for him as a photographer. Soon we were waved through to a kind of gravel parking lot where an assortment of sleepy-looking international media were waiting. CNN, ZDF, AFP, and a few other minor acronyms. A portly general came over to greet us and escort us to an area nearby where a canopy of camouflage and some plastic chairs had been set up. There were even sugar cookies and pink lemonade. As a group of us converged around the suites, I noticed a familiar face. Mr. Ziad, the one-time head of the press center who had once expelled me from Iraq. He smiled sheepishly when I greeted him, and he told me in German he was now working as a translator for ZDF. Here we were again in a familiar scene, obedient lambs being herded through another photo op. A middle-aged blonde general named Janis Karpinski would be our guide to the new and improved Abu Ghraib prison. A brigadier general appointed by Donald Rumsfeld in early 2003 and the highest-ranking military woman in Iraq, Karpinski would be suspended by the Pentagon after the abuse scandal broke. Although she ran Abu Ghraib and oversaw the entire prison system in Iraq, she would plead ignorance of any wrongful activities and insist that she was a scapegoat for higher-ups. "We welcome you to our central detention facility, a work in progress," began the handsome general. Her accent was vaguely Midwestern, her tone earnest. "We'll end up at the death chamber where you can do one-on-one interviews with some of the staff. And by the way, thanks for coming out here today. It gives us an opportunity to show you how much progress is being made in this country. This is an opportunity to show you what coalition forces and Iraqis working with us can do for this country. Feel free to ask questions, even of the soldiers running the facility." I almost expected her to sing the Star-Spangled Banner. A few months ago, General Karpinski said proudly, "You would have seen only large piles of rubble here. The facility was looted after Saddam opened the doors and let the prison population out on the streets of Baghdad. We have several different locations here. There are 240 prisoners on the ground. We have the capacity for 600, but we're moving them in incrementally. We also have Camp Gansey, a quick response for criminals, a blueprint for a hasty confinement facility with concertina wire and guard towers. We have about 800 there. We have a very small population of security detainees. The ones that are left over are in Camp Buka or Qasr. That's the Gulf port in southern Iraq." Robert started the question period with a good one. "General Karpinski, how do you define criminal?" "Well, sometimes we get confused too," responded the general. "Here, criminal refers to Iraqi on Iraqi crime, rape, theft, curfew violations. The rest are security detainees. But here there are less than a dozen." I wondered how a curfew violation might count as an Iraqi on Iraqi crime, and thought of all the stories I'd heard of innocent taxi drivers caught in checkpoint mayhem, fathers ratted on by neighbors who wanted to steal their houses, students wrongfully imprisoned for months for no other crime than being Palestinian. Just how loose was their definition of a security detainee? Robert continued with his genteel yet pointed line of questioning. "Do you talk to them, General? The criminals and the detainees?" "Yes, we do. We talk to them. We ask if they're relaxed, comfortable, and have everything they need. Several days ago, the MPs, the military police, went out to Camp Gansey and they called off a list of 30 names and said, 'Get on the bus because you're being released.' And then they called out a list of 20 who weren't being released, but were being taken into the main Abu Ghraib facility. Once the criminals came inside, they said, 'This is very nice. How much do we have to pay to stay here?' I wondered if this was gallows humor, but the general's tone was totally devoid of irony. And just a little addition here. Towards the end of this tour, where we go through the death chamber and she lowers the hanging platform and makes this terrible sound, and we interview the creepy old doctor with shifty eyes, who seems to be an expert on what kind of torture took place under the old regime. He's probably getting paid 3 times as much now, though. I was beginning to feel a little sorry for the general. She looked like a good gal. In another time or place, she might have been someone's favorite gym teacher or the CEO of a small company. In fact, in a St. Petersburg Times profile of Karpinski, published a few months later, I would learn that, in her civilian life, Karpinski is a consultant who runs grueling executive training programs for those hoping to scale the corporate ladder. The course, which puts participants under various kinds of stress, they're not a lot of fun, but they're a true test of the toughness of an individual's mettle. So we've gone from the riot to the airport to the prison, and I thought I would do something a little more entertaining about parties in Baghdad. This is the chapter called Baghdad by Night. So it starts with this description of a rather wild party I went to under the old regime in the Sabian Club. The Sabian Club was, the Sabians are followers of John the Baptist. So they're one of these really amazing, I mean, you know, Iraq is so not a monolith, you know, it's Arab and Kurdish and Muslim and Christian, and it's got all these really interesting religious minorities, old, you know, ancient sects that go back to biblical times. Although, sadly, of course, the invasion by a, you know, initiated by a born-again Christian president has made things much more dangerous for Christians and other religious minorities. But anyway, this was back when the Sabian Club was a real hotspot because it was one of the few places under the embargo that still served liquor openly. It had been all the nightclubs and cabarets that Baghdad used to be famous for had slowly closed down because of the sanctions induced crime wave, because people would go and drink and get into fights. So this was in 2000. The Sabians are an Iraqi religious sect who, while neither officially Christians nor Jews, are followers of John the Baptist. The main attraction of their club was that alcohol could be purchased and consumed on the premises, a rarity since public drinking was banned in 1993 as a crime reduction method in increasingly desperate times. The club itself was fairly typical of post-revolutionary 60s architecture, a square quadrangle with the omnipresent portrait of Saddam Hussein gracing the entrance. The president had as many guises as Lord Krishna, including a Tyrolean outfit and another that included a Panama hat and, presumably, a Cuban cigar. I sat with my minder, Allah, and the club's president and his family. The president's beautiful 19-year-old daughter, who was soon to depart for Germany where her Iraqi fiancé lived, sat beside him. Her name was Ishtar, and she looked like a film star. Everyone drank whiskey on the rocks and ate salted pistachios. Soon, plates of kebab and bowls of hummus and salad arrived. On a makeshift stage, a well-known singer crooned traditional love songs as couples got up to dance. Among the club's respectable middle-aged married couples, several pairs of handsome young men dressed in tight jeans were shaking their shoulders and moving their hips and hands in a serpentine arabesque. I sensed a mild disturbance as the president left our table and went over to the same-sex couples. After a few friendly but stern words from the benevolent patriarch, the male couples dispersed, some holding hands as they left the dance floor. I assumed the worst. But after a quick introduction to the renowned Iraqi poet Abdul Razak Abdul Wahid, who was sitting at the adjoining table with his family, I wasn't sure what was going on. Abdul Razak had been well known in the 60s when his international friendships included an acquaintance with the late Allen Ginsberg. No, it's not what you think, he assured me. This is not about homophobia. Those boys are only dancing together because they have no sisters and they are too shy to ask a girl to dance. A few minutes later, another boy-boy couple got up to dance. After a brief exchange of words between one of the boys and a man dancing beside them with his wife, some fisticuffs were exchanged, and in no time the scrap became a violent free-for-all with friends and family members on both sides joining in. The dance floor was littered with blood and broken glass. "Just ignore it," said Allah, trying desperately to look unruffled. "It will all be over soon." The club president and some security men moved the scuffle off the dance floor. The band continued to play, and some more married couples got up to dance. Beneath the sounds of oriental drums and keyboards, I could hear screams and police sirens. Now, of course, the sound of violence threatened to drown out the love songs. It was much louder, much less contained. What would a night out be like in post-invasion Baghdad, I wondered. One thing was certain. As a woman in the new Iraq, the ritual of discarding the maternity clothes/peasant look for a genuine party dress was a real thrill, if not an outright act of defiance, because we had to dress in, post-invasion in these outfits for modesty. So when some Greek journalists at my hotel told me there was a soiree at the Greek ambassador's residence, I was ready to roll. There's something about driving around an occupied city oppressed by unbearable heat and despair that will age you beyond your years. So I took great pains to try and revive my exhausted self. I chose a pink dress with straps, high heels, and my all-purpose Uzbeki shawl cover-up as a replacement for my overworked daytime hijab. I emerged from my room transformed. After a gut-wrenching journey with a driver who had no idea where the address was, we had to stop several times in the dark to quiz armed guards, kids with guns, for directions, I arrived to find that no one else was there. I had the wrong night. The ambassador, a charming man, was pleasantly surprised to see me and tried his best to persuade me to stay the night for security reasons. But when I politely declined his offer, there was a good sport about it all, and half an hour before the 11 p.m. curfew, accompanied me back across town with his driver in an SUV, armed with a pistol and a global positioning device. We were stopped at an American military checkpoint by a young man with a southern twang. He was immensely polite as he inquired after the driver's weapons card and apologized by rote for any inconvenience he might have caused. It was a military meets McDonald's drive-through experience. The streets were dark and deserted, except for the odd sight of kids playing soccer on the empty roads. They only stopped to let tanks pass by. My heart now a little aflutter, because they shoot you if you're out after 11, even before, any time. My heart now a little aflutter, I sang Leonard Cohen songs with the ambassador all the way across town, because he was Greek and Canadian and seemed appropriate. It was a kind of darker version of Rodgers and Hammerstein's Whenever I Feel Afraid refrain. So I'm going to sing this now. You can sing it with me if you know it. The stories of the street are mine, the Spanish voices laugh. The Cadillacs go creeping down through the night in the poison gas. And I lean from my window sill in this old hotel at shows. One hand on my suicide, one hand on the rose. Da, da, da. I know you've heard it's over now and war must surely come. The cities, they are broken half, but the middlemen are gone. And let me ask you one more time, O children of the dust, these hunters who are shrieking now, do they speak for us? Da, da, da. Where do all these highways go now that we are free? Why are the armies marching still that we're coming home to me? Etc., etc., etc. It worked. Cohen's songs seemed the perfect soundtrack for these dark Baghdad nights. I arrived back at my hotel, relieved but strangely exhilarated, at least much more than I would have been had I stayed in for another night of American B-movies subtitled in Arabic. The next evening, I returned to the Greek ambassador's house. This time I found a party in full swing, complete with champagne and canapes served by Iraqi waiters and beautiful Greek girls who worked for an Athens-based NGO. Elle was there as well, with a Greek woman named Aphrodite. Elle is the security business guy. In fact, his cook had provided the elaborate Italian smorgasbord that awaited us in the dining room. After days of hotel food, this was a little bit of heaven. But it was the kind of paradise that made me think of the Hashashins, the old, the Hashashins who would drug new recruits, take them to lavish palaces, and then, once hooked on the lifestyle, force them into a life of crime. I could get used to this, I thought, but at what price? "What's wrong, Hadani?" asked the Greek ambassador, offering me a fan made out of palm fronds. "You look a little worried." As he fanned me, I told the ambassador about my musings on the nature of change in Iraq. "But of course," he said, "here it's just a case of changer la femme. It's the same as before. Life is always the same. For the last 25,000 years, Baghdad has remained the same. It's all a game of power, love, and money." It was comforting to hear the dulcet tones of a wise old Greek observing the new Romans from the sidelines. Okay, last little bit. So I've taken you through the riot, the airport, the prison, the party. Now we're going to go to church. It might blast because it might be. Here we go. So this is at a church in Baghdad in September of 2003. About 8 or 9 months later, there were fire bombings of churches throughout Iraq. The Chaldeans, this is a Chaldean church, just to explain, are the inheritors of the sort of Babylonian tradition, much like the Copts in Egypt are inheritors of the pharaonic tradition. So they really were the link back to ancient Iraq. And Christians enjoyed a very prominent place in Iraqi society under the old regime. Tariq Aziz was Christian, etc. Because it was a police state, but it was a secular police state. After Mass, many women stopped at a special shrine inside the church, touching it, kneeling before it, praying fervently in front of it. Shlam al-Alq Maryam Latana, they recited in Chaldean, which is close to Aramaic. Hail Mary, full of grace. Their faces were young, old, pretty and plain, but their eyes all had a look of profound weariness, as if they'd grown tired of waiting for miracles. I spoke with some of the women in the courtyard. Is it easy to be a Christian now? I asked. An older woman with a friendly face and long gray hair told me, some are afraid to come to church now because of the crime. More people came to Mass before. Yes, it's very dangerous in the streets now, agreed her friend, but there is no problem between Muslims and Christians here. A young woman, maybe 35, with thick auburn hair, spoke up. My name is Linda Naim Youssef, she told me. Linda was dressed in a velour leopard print outfit. Now, you know, there are only two classes, she said, poor and middle class. And we, in the middle class, we're just living day by day. Our income barely enough to survive. It's hard for us to provide for our children. All these new things they see in the market, electronic gadgets, computers, so expensive. They need so many things, but we can't afford them. She paused for a moment to touch her rosary. You know, under Saddam, times were better for Iraqis. The Iraqi Christian girl could go out on the streets to the church with her head held high. Now it's not safe. We can't even go out to visit our friends and relatives. I knew that under Saddam's secular Ba'athist state, Christians and other religious minorities had enjoyed a sense of protection. But the situation that Linda was describing was not one of religious intolerance so much as a lack of security bordering on anarchy. When I brought out my video camera to film some of the church's facade, a small crowd gathered in front of me. They knew I was a Canadian journalist and somehow assumed that I was filming directly for Canadian television. People began to approach the camera and make heartfelt appeals to their friends and relatives in Canada. A woman and her young daughter came forward, took my tiny microphone and said, I send special regards to Father Edouard and to Sister Nabila in Montreal, and my very best regards to Iraqi Christians in Canada and Detroit. Another lady said, hello to Sarab in Toronto and condolences for your wife. Then she said, to no one in particular, we miss them so much, but they never called us. And hello to our uncle. Her sister began to speak. We are sending regards to friends in Toronto. We are all well. There is still no telephone, but they are working on it. And Uncle George, we did everything we could when your mom died. She looked as though she might burst into tears. I began to feel the same way. A middle-aged woman named Shonia came to me and complained, "My dad died a month ago, and none of my relatives in Canada helped me. No one contacted me." I had morphed into a kind of itinerant Canadian consul. An old man came forward in an agitated state and said, "I want to speak to my son. I want to speak to him." He told me his name was Hana Toma, then took the microphone and said, "I miss my son and haven't heard from him in 6 months. He is in Toronto. Please, Milad, please write to me." Later, the man asked me how he could apply for a visa to go to see his son, explained that there was no embassy in Baghdad, and suggested that he go to Amman. Of course, he just shrugged his shoulders in despair. There was no way he could afford the thousands of dollars such a trip would entail. He couldn't even afford to telephone Canada. The old man thrust a piece of paper into my hand with his son's email address and phone number on it. "Please call him for me," he begged. "Please." The email address was a variation of Snoop Doggy Dog with indecipherable punctuation and numerals. Later, back in Canada, I tried to ring the phone number. It turned out to be a Chaldean church in North York, which is near Toronto, but there was never any answer except for one time when a woman answered in Arabic and then hung up. Finally, one night, after weeks of unsuccessful ringing, another woman answered and passed me directly to Father Johannes, who introduced himself as the Chaldean Bishop of Canada. I explained who I was and why I was calling. After some language difficulties, he finally said, "Yes, Milad, I think he is a member of our basketball team." Father Johannes assured me he would tell Milad to call his elderly father in Baghdad the next time they met. Then he said, almost as if he were conducting Mass over the phone, "And please, we must all pray for peace and tranquility in Iraq through the intercession of Our Lady."